The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Wilson entered the room. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, and his tailored suit set him apart from the casually dressed students. Everyone knew his reputation, brilliant but merciless. He wrote complex equations on the board without explanation and expected everyone to keep up. In the back row sat Raj, hunched over a worn notebook. Unlike most students, his clothes were faded and patched in places. He worked evenings at a local diner to pay for his education, often arriving to class exhausted but determined. Today, Professor Wilson announced, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses, "We'll discuss advanced differential equations. I assume you've all completed the pre-reading." His eyes scanned the classroom, searching for any sign of confusion to pounce on. Raj had indeed read ahead, despite working a double shift the night before. Math had always been his escape, a world where poverty didn't matter, where only the elegant dance of numbers counted. Since childhood, he'd solved equations in his head while helping his mother clean houses or during his father's long hospital stays. Professor Wilson began writing a complex equation across the board. "This problem took my doctoral students 3 days to solve," he said with a hint of pride. "I don't expect any of you to grasp it immediately, but we'll work through it step by." He paused, noticing movement in the back. Raj had raised his hand. "Yes?" Professor Wilson's tone suggested interruptions were unwelcome. "Sir, I think there might be a faster approach to that problem," Raj said quietly. The professor's eyebrows rose. Students glanced at each other nervously. Nobody challenged Professor Wilson. "Is that so?" The professor crossed his arms. "Perhaps you'd like to enlighten us all?" Raj hesitated. He didn't want attention. He just loved math and saw a beautiful pattern in the equation. "Come down here," Professor Wilson commanded, extending a piece of chalk. "Show us this faster approach." The walk to the front felt endless. Whispers followed Raj as he made his way down the steps. Some students snickered, expecting entertainment at his expense. Others looked away, embarrassed for what they assumed would be his public humiliation. Raj took the chalk with shaking fingers. He faced the board, took a deep breath, and began to write. The professor's smirk faded as Raj's hand moved confidently across the board. Where the professor had used traditional methods, Raj applied an elegant transformation, revealing a pattern hidden within the complexity. His approach wasn't just faster, it was beautiful in its simplicity. Professor Wilson's expression shifted from amusement to confusion, then disbelief. The classroom remained completely silent. When Raj finished, he placed the chalk down and turned to face the class. For a moment, no one spoke. "That's..." Professor Wilson examined the work carefully. "That's an unusual approach." Raj nodded respectfully. "My father taught me to look for patterns when I was young. He used to say math is like a puzzle where the picture is already perfect, we just need to find the right way to see it." The professor cleared his throat. "And where did you study before this?" "Just public school, sir. But we had a good library." Raj didn't mention the mathematics books he'd borrowed repeatedly, solving problems by candlelight when their electricity was cut off. "I see." Professor Wilson seemed to be reassessing the young man before him. "Well, your method works, though it's unorthodox. You may return to your seat." As Raj walked back up the steps, the whispers had changed. Students looked at him with newfound respect, some with curiosity. He returned to his worn notebook, uncomfortable with the attention but quietly pleased that the beauty he saw in mathematics had been recognized. After class, while others filed out, Professor Wilson called out, "You, stay behind for a moment." Raj approached the professor's desk cautiously. "Where did you really learn that technique?" Professor Wilson demanded. "It's not in any undergraduate textbook I know of." "I just see it that way, sir," Raj replied honestly. When I look at equations, sometimes different paths just appear to me. The professor studied him with narrowed eyes. Do you have any idea what you just did? That transformation is similar to work being done at graduate level in top universities. Raj shifted uncomfortably. I need to get to my job, sir. I can't be late again. Job? What job? I wash dishes at Lorenzo's diner. Evening shift. Professor Wilson seemed surprised, as if only now noticing Raj's worn clothes and tired eyes. Something changed in his expression, not quite softening, but recalculating. Be here tomorrow, 15 minutes before class, he said finally. I want to see what else you can do. Raj nodded, uncertain whether he was in trouble or being tested. As he hurried out, his mind was already on his work shift, calculating how many hours of sleep he might get before tomorrow's classes. What he didn't know was that this interaction would change the course of his life, and Professor Wilson's too. That night at Lorenzo's diner, Raj's mind kept returning to the classroom while his hands moved mechanically through soapy water. The look on Professor Wilson's face when he'd solved that equation had been worth the embarrassment. You're smiling tonight, remarked Mrs. Patel, the cook who sometimes brought him leftover food. Something good happen at school? Raj shrugged. Just solved a math problem, that's all. He returned to his tiny apartment well past midnight, muscles aching. His roommate was already asleep, so Raj quietly arranged his textbooks on the floor beside his mattress. Despite his exhaustion, he opened his math notebook and reviewed tomorrow's material. Professor Wilson wanted to see him early, and he wouldn't go unprepared. Morning came too soon. Raj arrived at the lecture hall 15 minutes before class as instructed, finding Professor Wilson already there, writing equations on the board. Ah, you actually came, the professor said without turning around. Good. He finished writing, then faced Raj. Solve this. He pointed to a complex equation that filled nearly half the board. Raj studied it carefully. This was different from yesterday's problem, more intricate, with multiple approaches possible. May I? He asked, reaching for the chalk. Professor Wilson nodded, watching intently as Raj began working through the problem. Unlike yesterday's burst of intuition, this required methodical work. Raj muttered to himself occasionally, crossing out approaches that led to dead ends. 10 minutes passed. Other students began filtering in, surprised to find Raj already at the board. They watched silently, sensing something important was happening. Finally, Raj circled his answer. I think that's it. Professor Wilson checked the work meticulously, his expression unreadable. Correct, he finally said. But you took a rather roundabout path here and here. He pointed to 2 steps. I know another way, Raj admitted. But I wasn't sure if it was accepted. Mathematics isn't about what's accepted, boy. It's about what's true. The professor's voice had lost some of its usual edge. Show me. Raj erased part of his work and demonstrated the alternative approach, one he discovered himself when studying late one night. Professor Wilson's eyes widened slightly. Where did you learn this? I didn't, exactly. I just tried different ways until I found patterns that worked. Before the professor could respond, the classroom had filled completely. Students whispered among themselves, wondering why the poorly dressed student from yesterday was again at the board with Professor Wilson. We'll continue this discussion later, the professor said quietly. Then, turning to the class, he announced, today's session will be taught by Mr. He looked at Raj questioningly. Raj Kumar, sir. Mr. Kumar will demonstrate an approach to complex differential equations that some of you might find illuminating. Raj froze. Sir, I can't. Yes, you can. Consider it part of your education. Professor Wilson handed him the chalk and took a seat in the front row. Terrified, Raj faced the class. Dozens of eyes stared back at him, some curious, others skeptical. He'd never spoken to a crowd before. His heart pounded. But when he turned to the equation on the board, something changed. The numbers and symbols seemed to welcome him like old friends. He took a deep breath and began explaining, his voice gaining confidence with each word. Professor Wilson watched, his face thoughtful, as the formerly invisible student commanded the classroom with quiet authority, revealing the elegant patterns hidden within the mathematics. What neither of them realized was that someone else was watching too, a visitor standing at the back of the lecture hall, listening with growing interest to the young man's brilliant explanation. As class ended, students surrounded Raj, bombarding him with questions. He'd never received so much attention and didn't know how to handle it. Math made sense, people were more complicated. That's enough, Professor Wilson's voice cut through the crowd. Mr. Kumar has another appointment. Relieved, Raj gathered his worn notebook, wondering what the professor meant. Come with me, Professor Wilson said, leading Raj through unfamiliar corridors to the mathematics department office. Dean Sharma, this is the student I mentioned. A distinguished older woman looked up from her desk. Mr. Kumar? Please, sit down. Raj perched awkwardly on the edge of a leather chair, acutely aware of his faded clothes in these elegant surroundings. Professor Wilson tells me you have an unusual talent for mathematics, Dean Sharma said, studying him carefully. I just see patterns, ma'am. He's being modest, Professor Wilson interjected. What he demonstrated today goes beyond seeing patterns. He developed an original approach to solving complex differential equations. The dean nodded thoughtfully. The visitor who observed your class was quite impressed. Dr. Rao is from the International Mathematical Research Institute. Raj's eyes widened. Everyone in mathematics knew about the prestigious IMRI. He'd like to meet you, she continued. But first, I have a question. Why haven't any of your previous professors identified your abilities? Raj looked down. I transferred here this semester, ma'am. Before that, I was at community college while working full-time. I didn't participate much in class. And your high school? We didn't have advanced math courses, Raj explained quietly. But there was a teacher who gave me extra books sometimes. Professor Wilson was pacing now. It's a travesty. This boy has been washing dishes when he could have been advancing mathematical theory. Raj had never heard such conviction in the professor's voice. Dean Sharma leaned forward. Mr. Kumar, we'd like to offer you a full scholarship, including living expenses. Raj couldn't breathe. Ma'am? The department has discretionary funds for exceptional cases. Professor Wilson is convinced you qualify. Raj looked at Professor Wilson in disbelief. The arrogant man who had tried to humiliate him yesterday was now advocating for him? You need time to focus on mathematics, Professor Wilson said, avoiding eye contact. Not on washing dishes. I don't understand, Raj admitted. Yesterday, you seemed to. Yesterday I was a fool, Professor Wilson interrupted. I judged you by your appearance, not your mind. It was unprofessional. The closest thing to an apology Raj expected from such a proud man. There's one condition, Dean Sharma added. You'll work closely with Professor Wilson on research. He believes your unique perspective could lead to significant breakthroughs. Raj looked between them, overwhelmed. I need to quit my job. Immediately, Professor Wilson confirmed. For the first time in years, Raj felt the weight lifting from his shoulders. No more exhausted nights. No more choosing between books and food. When do we start? He asked quietly. Professor Wilson almost smiled. We already have. The weeks that followed transformed Raj's life. He moved from his cramped apartment to university housing, a small but private room with a desk that didn't wobble. The scholarship provided enough for proper meals and new clothes. For the first time, he could focus entirely on mathematics. Professor Wilson proved to be a demanding mentor. Their research sessions often lasted late into the night, with the professor pushing Raj to formalize his intuitive approaches. "It's not enough to see the pattern," Professor Wilson insisted one evening, tapping the whiteboard covered in equations. "You must prove why it works." Raj nodded, understanding the professor's point even as he found it frustrating. "But sometimes I just know the answer before I can explain how I got there." "That's precisely why you need rigorous training," Professor Wilson replied. "Your raw talent is remarkable, but without structure, it won't reach its potential." Their working relationship remained tense but productive. Other students watched with curiosity as Raj transitioned from invisible back row student to Professor Wilson's protégé. Not everyone was supportive. One afternoon, Raj overheard two teaching assistants talking outside the lab. "Wilson's pet project," one said dismissively. "The professor's trying to prove he's not elitist by taking in a charity case." "I heard the kid's from some village in the middle of nowhere," the other replied. "Probably just a one-trick mathematical savant. Watch him flame out by semester's end." Raj walked away silently, their words stinging more than he wanted to admit. That evening, he struggled to concentrate during his session with Professor Wilson. "You're distracted," the professor noted sharply. "Mathematics requires full attention." Raj hesitated, then asked, "Sir, do you think I'm just a curiosity? Someone with a few mathematical tricks but not real understanding?" Professor Wilson set down his chalk and studied Raj carefully. "Is that what's bothering you? What others think?" "I overheard some comments," Raj admitted. The professor snorted. "When I published my first paper, my own doctoral advisor suggested it was a fluke. Mediocre minds always resent exceptional ones." "But what if they're right?" Raj pressed. "What if this is all I can do?" Professor Wilson's expression changed, becoming less severe. "When I first saw your work, I assumed it was memorized. Then I watched you solve problems you'd never seen before. Your approach isn't a trick, it's genuine insight." He paused. "The kind that comes along perhaps once in a generation." Raj looked up, surprised by the rare compliment. "Dr. Rao from the Institute agrees," Professor Wilson continued. "He's arranged for you to present at the International Conference on Mathematical Innovation next month." "Present? Me?" Raj felt panic rising. "I can't speak to hundreds of mathematicians." "You spoke to a classroom," Professor Wilson countered. "This is no different. It's completely different. Those were just students, not world-class mathematicians." Professor Wilson almost smiled. "And what do you think you're becoming?" The question hung in the air between them, a possibility Raj had never dared imagine for himself. The conference was held in a grand hotel that made Raj feel even more out of place than usual. Mathematicians from around the world gathered in small groups, discussing theories in multiple languages. Despite his new clothes, Raj felt the gap between himself and these academics who had spent their lives in universities. "Stop fidgeting," Professor Wilson whispered as they registered at the welcome desk. "You belong here as much as anyone." Dr. Rao, the visiting researcher who had spotted Raj in class, greeted them warmly. He was a kind-faced man with silver hair who immediately put Raj more at ease. "I've been telling everyone about you," he said enthusiastically. "Your approach to the Hamilton-Jacobi equation is causing quite a stir." Professor Wilson nodded. "Several colleagues have already requested copies of our preliminary paper." Raj hadn't realized their work together had circulated so widely. "Really?" "Really," Dr. Rao confirmed. "Though some are skeptical, of course. Professor Chen in particular has questions about your methodology." Professor Wilson's expression darkened. Chen always questions anything he didn't think of first. They were interrupted by the arrival of a stern-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses. "Speaking of me, Wilson?" he asked coldly. "Chen," Professor Wilson acknowledged stiffly. "Meet Raj Kumar, my research associate." Professor Chen barely glanced at Raj. "So this is your prodigy?" His tone made the word sound like an insult. "I look forward to tomorrow's presentation. It should be educational." After he walked away, Raj looked questioningly at Professor Wilson. "We have history," the professor explained grudgingly. "Academic disagreements." Dr. Rao chuckled. "What Wilson isn't telling you is that Chen was his rival during graduate school. They've been trying to outdo each other for 20 years. Raj spent that night in his hotel room reviewing his presentation slides. Professor Wilson had helped him prepare, but the thought of facing hundreds of experts made his stomach churn. What if he froze? What if his breakthrough wasn't really a breakthrough at all? Morning came too quickly. The presentation hall was packed, with Professor Chen sitting prominently in the front row. "Remember," Professor Wilson said backstage, "you know this material better than anyone in that room." When Raj's name was announced, he walked to the podium on shaky legs. The bright lights nearly blinded him, and his first words came out as a whisper. "Could you speak up?" called a voice from the audience. Raj adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began again. As he explained his approach to solving the equations, his nervousness gradually melted away. The mathematical concepts flowed naturally, and he found himself drawing connections beyond what he and Professor Wilson had prepared. Halfway through, he noticed Professor Chen leaning forward with intense concentration. Other mathematicians were whispering excitedly, pointing at the equations on screen. When Raj concluded his explanation, the hall remained silent for a long moment. Then someone began to applaud, followed by another, until the entire room erupted in applause. All except Professor Chen, who sat motionless, his expression unreadable. The question-and-answer session following Raj's presentation was intense. Mathematicians from prestigious universities peppered him with technical questions that he answered with growing confidence. Professor Wilson stood at the side of the stage, arms crossed, a hint of pride showing through his usually stern expression. Then Professor Chen stood up. "Your approach is certainly creative," he began, his voice carrying across the now silent hall. "But I see a fundamental flaw in your reasoning." Raj felt his confidence waver. "Which part, sir?" "Your transformation in step 4. Chen gestured dismissively. "It appears elegant, but it fails under specific boundary conditions." A murmur swept through the audience. Professor Wilson stepped forward, but Raj raised his hand slightly, stopping him. "May I see your counterexample, Professor Chen?" Raj asked politely. Chen walked to the whiteboard and wrote out a complex equation. "Apply your method to this, young man." Raj studied the equation carefully, aware of hundreds of eyes watching him. Chen had deliberately constructed a problem that seemed to break his approach. For a moment, doubt crept in. Then Raj saw it, not just the solution, but something more. He took the marker from Chen and began working through the problem, adding an extra step that hadn't been part of his original method. The hall was completely silent except for the squeak of the marker against the whiteboard. When he finished, Raj turned to face Chen. "You're right that my original approach would fail here. But with this modification, it not only works but reveals a deeper connection to the Riemann hypothesis." Gasps came from several mathematicians who recognized the significance. Even Chen looked momentarily stunned. "That's..." Chen examined the board carefully. "That's not possible. You couldn't have." "I believe he just did," Professor Wilson said quietly, stepping forward. "Raj has extended the method beyond what we published." The moderator tried to move on to the next presenter, but audience members were already rushing forward, surrounding Raj with questions and congratulations. Academic publishers approached, asking about his future work. University representatives handed him business cards. In the chaos, Raj lost sight of Professor Chen. Later, during the conference dinner, he spotted the man sitting alone at a corner table. Against Professor Wilson's advice, Raj approached him. "Professor Chen, I wanted to thank you." Chen looked up, surprised. "Thank me? For what?" "Your challenge forced me to see a limitation in my approach. Without that, I wouldn't have found the extension." Chen studied him for a long moment. Most mathematicians would have been defensive. Raj smiled slightly. "Math isn't about ego. It's about finding truth, right?" In theory, Chen agreed with a wry smile. Though in practice. He glanced across the room at Professor Wilson, who was watching them suspiciously. "He's not so bad once you get to know him," Raj said, following Chen's gaze. "Perhaps." Chen hesitated, then added, "Your background is unusual for someone with your abilities." "You mean because I'm poor?" Raj asked directly. Chen's expression softened slightly. "I was a farmer's son in rural China. My village had one mathematics textbook, which I read by candlelight. When I see you, I remember." For the first time, Raj realized that his story wasn't entirely unique. Others had walked similar paths before him. The conference changed everything. Upon returning to campus, Raj found himself suddenly visible. Students approached him for help, professors invited him to their advanced seminars, and the university newspaper ran a front-page story about his breakthrough. Professor Wilson seemed both pleased and concerned by the attention. "Don't let it distract you," he warned during one of their research sessions. "Fame is fleeting. Mathematics is eternal." But even he couldn't shield Raj from the most unexpected development, an offer letter from Cambridge University, personally signed by Professor Chen. "He wants me to join their applied mathematics program," Raj explained, showing Professor Wilson the letter. "With a full international scholarship." Professor Wilson stared at the letter for a long moment. "Cambridge is an excellent institution," he finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "You're not surprised? Chen mentioned he was impressed by you." Professor Wilson returned the letter. "It's a good opportunity." Something in his tone made Raj pause. "You don't want me to accept?" "It's not my decision." Professor Wilson busied himself organizing papers. "You should consider all options before deciding." That evening, Raj visited Mrs. Patel at Lorenzo's diner, where he'd once washed dishes. She insisted on serving him the special, refusing payment. "So proud of you," she beamed. "My son never studied, but you worked so hard." "I got lucky," Raj said, embarrassed by her praise. "Not luck," she corrected firmly. "Hard work and God-given talent. Now you'll go to England and become famous." Raj stared at her. "How did you know about Cambridge?" She laughed. "Professor Wilson was here earlier. Looked miserable, poor man. Said his best student was leaving." The realization hit Raj like a physical force. Professor Wilson had come to the diner, a place he'd surely never visited before, and had spoken of Raj as his best student. The next morning, Raj knocked on Professor Wilson's office door. "Come in," came the gruff response. Raj found the professor surrounded by books and papers, looking like he hadn't slept. "Sir, I wanted to discuss the Cambridge offer." "Have you accepted?" Professor Wilson asked without looking up. "Not yet. I wanted your honest opinion first." Professor Wilson finally met his eyes. "My honest opinion? Chen is offering you a remarkable opportunity. Cambridge has resources we can't match." "That's not what I asked," Raj said quietly. "I asked what you think I should do." Something flickered across Professor Wilson's face, vulnerability, perhaps. I think. He began, then stopped. I think you should make the choice that best serves your mathematical development. And if I want to stay and continue our research together? The professor's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then I would say Cambridge's loss is our gain. Raj smiled. Mrs. Patel said you called me your best student. Professor Wilson looked embarrassed. The woman misunderstood me. Did she? For the first time since Raj had known him, Professor Wilson smiled, genuinely, without reservation. Perhaps not entirely. Raj's decision to stay ignited a new phase in his work with Professor Wilson. Their research expanded, combining Raj's intuitive leaps with the professor's methodical rigor. What had begun as an uneasy partnership evolved into a true collaboration. 6 months after the conference, they were preparing to publish their second paper when Dean Sharma called them both to her office. The National Science Foundation has taken notice of your work, she announced, beaming. They're offering a substantial grant to establish a new research center here, with both of you as co-directors. Professor Wilson looked stunned. That's unprecedented for a student. Former student, Dean Sharma corrected. The board has reviewed Mr. Kumar's contributions and approved an extraordinary appointment as junior faculty, bypassing the usual doctoral requirements. Raj could hardly believe what he was hearing. From dishwasher to faculty in less than a year? As they left the dean's office, Professor Wilson seemed lost in thought. Everything is happening very quickly, he finally said. Too quickly? Raj asked. I spent 15 years working before receiving my first significant grant, the professor replied. You've done it in months. Raj detected a hint of the old bitterness in his voice. Because of your guidance, he said carefully. This is your achievement too. Professor Wilson shook his head. No. I merely removed obstacles. The mathematical insight is entirely yours. That weekend, Raj took a bus to visit his parents. He hadn't seen them since before the conference, too caught up in his new life. Their small apartment felt smaller than he remembered. His mother cried when he told her about the faculty position. His father, who had worked construction his whole life despite his love for mathematics, sat quietly listening. Are you happy? His father finally asked. The question caught Raj by surprise. Of course. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. Good. But remember why you loved mathematics in the first place, not for positions or grants, but for its beauty. His father's words stayed with Raj as he returned to campus. The next morning, he found Professor Wilson already in their shared office, staring at an equation on the whiteboard. I've been thinking, the professor said without preamble. About what happens next. The research center? Beyond that. Professor Wilson turned to face him. You'll surpass me, you know. Probably within a few years. Raj started to protest, but the professor raised his hand. It's not a complaint. It's mathematics. Your talent is greater than mine, I've accepted that. It's not about who's better, Raj argued. We approach problems differently. That's why our collaboration works. Professor Wilson considered this. Perhaps. But I want you to promise me something. What's that? When you find students of your own, and you will, remember how we began. Remember how easy it is to misjudge someone based on appearances. Raj smiled slowly. Someone arrogant, you mean? Like a certain professor? For a moment, Professor Wilson looked offended. Then he chuckled, a sound Raj had rarely heard. Touché. 5 years passed. The Research Center for Mathematical Innovation thrived under Raj and Professor Wilson's leadership. Their collaborative papers revolutionized several fields, and students from around the world applied to study with them. On a crisp autumn day, Raj stood at the front of a packed lecture hall, the same one where he had first solved Professor Wilson's equation. Now he was teaching the advanced seminar himself while the professor was on sabbatical. Today, Raj announced, we'll examine a particularly challenging problem in topological data analysis. As he wrote the equation on the board, Raj noticed a young woman in the back row. She wore a faded sweater, and her notebook was clearly second-hand. While other students typed on expensive laptops, she wrote with a pencil worn down to a stub. Throughout the lecture, Raj noticed her intense focus. When he posed a question that stumped the class, he saw her hesitate, then lower her hand before he could call on her. After class, as students filed out, Raj approached her. "You had an answer earlier, didn't you?" She looked startled. "I wasn't sure it was right. I'd still like to hear it." Nervously, she explained her approach, an elegant solution that showed remarkable insight. "That's excellent," Raj said. "Where did you study before this?" "Community college," she admitted. "I work evenings at the campus cafeteria to pay tuition." The parallels to his own story weren't lost on Raj. "What's your name?" "Leela, sir." "Well, Leela, I think you have a unique perspective on this material. Have you considered research as a career path?" She laughed softly. "People like me don't usually become researchers." "People like you?" Raj asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "From my background," she clarified. "No connections, no money." Raj smiled. "Let me tell you a story about a dishwasher who became a mathematician." That evening, Raj called Professor Wilson, now researching at Princeton for the year. "I think I've found our next research assistant," Raj explained after describing Leela. "You're sure?" Professor Wilson asked. "Based on one interaction? Weren't you sure about me after one equation?" The professor chuckled. "Touché again. Well, I trust your judgment." The next day, Raj waited in the cafeteria until he spotted Leela clearing tables. He approached with application papers for the research assistant position. Her hands trembled as she read the details. "This includes a stipend? And tuition?" Raj nodded. "Someone did this for me once. Changed my life." "The arrogant professor in your story?" she asked with a small smile. "He turned out to be not so arrogant after all," Raj replied. "Just someone who recognized talent in an unexpected place, and was humble enough to admit his mistake." As Leela signed the papers, Raj felt the circle complete itself. From student to teacher, from judge to mentor. The journey that had begun with humiliation had transformed not just his life, but Professor Wilson's too, and would now extend to a new generation. Mathematics had given Raj a language for understanding patterns. But his journey with Professor Wilson had taught him an equally valuable lesson, that the most important patterns weren't in equations, but in the connections between people.